It's 12th of November 2019. I've just went out for a early morning walk to get the Metro newspaper. It's quite a pleasant walk, and it's always nice to get that early morning fresh air. It's just after 7 a.m. I want to talk about the 30th anniversary of the wall coming down, the Berlin Wall, of course. What other wall would I be talking about? Which is a subject I mentioned I would talk about. I got a bit distracted by other things, but there is a lot of talking points with this, so I'm going to try my best to keep this somewhat restricted and not go too far off on a tangent. Also, incidentally, just after the 11th of November, we're now on the 101st anniversary of the end of the First World War. So, to me, that's now getting into another era, like really getting into another era. We're not talking ancient history, but it's getting further back now, which does give us pause for reflection. Anniversaries are something I'm always quite reflective about, big anniversaries. And one thing that's notable about this 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall is that it's now a longer period since the wall fell than the whole duration that the wall was up. If we consider the period 1961 to 1989, that's 28 years. So we're now 2 years longer than the whole duration that the wall was up. My lifetime is now longer than that duration, and that was a very long time. So we could look into that in any number of ways. One thing I think is fair to say that a lot of the hopes and aspirations perhaps that came with the wall coming down haven't entirely transpired. So Sky News reports on this anniversary, for example, held that there are still significant social divisions in Germany between East and West. One politician, I forget which party she was speaking for, said that in a lot of senses, in terms of unemployment, in terms of the wealth poverty gap, the wall is still metaphorically there, which is a somewhat sad indictment. On the other hand, there is a phenomenon in Germany which I understand is called Ostalgie. I may be pronouncing that wrong. It's basically nostalgia for the East, or incredibly nostalgia for the communist days. Now my sentiments, I have to say, seeing those images of the wall coming down is always very positive. Most people looking at internet comments still have those sentiments, including many Germans. That this was the end, not technically the end of the Cold War, that only formally came about 2 years later in 1991, but really it was the beginning of the end. And it's hard not to feel moved by those images. I mean, this was a whole generation of people kept behind the Iron Curtain, families divided. It really was a very, very symbolic moment, and definitely one of the defining images of the 20th century. I've been to Berlin 2005. I went for my 20th birthday, as it then was, with my father. We went to Checkpoint Charlie, we went to the Brandenburg Gate. I think Berlin would have to rank as one of the world's most interesting cities. Few cities have been on such a front line of history as Berlin has. Fascinating place. My former girlfriend, who's Chinese, she lives in Berlin now, and we were making small talk, and she told me that she went to the commemorations of this. And I posted this on Chinese social media, partly because it was on my mind, and partly I was sort of testing the water. And interestingly enough, I thought, if I kind of, is this going to be controversial? Because it's the end of communism in East Germany. But I got a lot of likes for it. Now, maybe it's safe enough ground because it's not really Chinese communism, but I was surprised that no one kind of saw that as like it's a Westerner being triumphalist. But what a lot of my Chinese friends said was, it's good, it's German reunification. So they looked at it less as the end of communism in East Germany and more about German reunification. That was, of course, the following year. I was only 4 at the time, so I'm too young to directly remember it. But I do feel a real connection with the 80s. Maybe not first hand. I don't remember the 80s directly from news reports, but it was a very eventful decade, particularly in this country. A lot of big disasters in Britain, and maybe I digress here. Lockerbie, Hillsborough, Piper Alpha, Zeebrugge, all those big disasters. The late 80s really was a very turbulent time. But amidst all those disasters, the fall of the Berlin Wall was a moment of optimism. And my former girlfriend, she was going to this event to celebrate. And this is someone from a communist country who I do have differences of opinion with regarding the Chinese Communist Party. I mean, she's not a red flag carrying communist, but we've had differences of opinion on that regard. And in terms of Tiananmen Square, which of course was a very different outlook in the same year. But I think that this, anyway, I digress a bit there. This nostalgia for the East, I think it's a real phenomenon, and to me it's kind of like Stockholm Syndrome. You're held hostage so long that you sort of feel some empathy for the hostage taker. In this case, the hostage taker is the East German Communist Party. I think one thing that a lot of East Germans felt was a sort of loss of community spirit, perhaps. The excellent film Goodbye Lenin, I'm going to do an individual review of that, but that really touches on this theme, that with the West came a lot more freedom, choice, consumerism, but maybe on some level a loss of community spirit. And in the early 90s there was a very serious problem, particularly in East Germany, with the rise of ultranationalism and the far right, ironically. I know in the city of Rostock, well, that's pushing more North Germany, but there was serious racial riots in the early 90s, and I believe there were some deadly attacks on refugees around that time. And of course, more recently, with Angela Merkel's very controversial policy in 2015. I was in Germany that year, in Dusseldorf, and I remember a check late at night. And that just was kind of an indication, a check on the train to see if any migrants had snuck on. As Germany, as Europe's biggest economy, this is something that Germany has had to face. And I think that a lot of that nostalgia comes from the sense that, misguided it may be, but in East Germany, under the old communist system, there was sort of a community spirit. There's a bit in Goodbye Lenin, and I'll talk more about the film in another video, but there's a bit where the East Germans kind of join this multinational company, or this big manufacturing company, and the guy, the foreman, is very sort of hands off and very clinical, and these guys are kind of shaking each other's hands and like, oh, I'm Klaus, I'm Sigmund, and so on. And it's a community spirit, because they still have that East German mentality of all the people together. And the foreman is sort of looking at them like, what's wrong with these guys? It's just it's a boring job. He couldn't understand that sort of mentality. But then again, and this was also featured in the Sky News report, a man who had been imprisoned by the East German secret police said that this nostalgia is very misplaced. I mean, as much as there may be hardships in post-war Germany, I think people should never forget, and it's not for me to talk about, the experience that people had. I was close to a woman from East Germany when I was at university. She was a bit older than me. She was an East German, and I think she definitely had this mentality. She was definitely to the left. Don't think she would call herself a communist, but she was definitely to the left. And I'm sure she had that mentality. But But people who sort of talk in nostalgic terms about the old communist system, they would do well to remember that in the 28 years of the wall, thousands of people tried to get into the West. Many succeeded, but at least 140 people were shot in cold blood for no other reason than trying to get out of the country. Now, what sort of system feels the need to keep people behind with machine guns? To me, that is a damning indictment of the communist system. Whatever flaws capitalism has, whatever problems that East Germans faced when, the wall fell, with wealth, poverty, discrepancy, with being overwhelmed by the price of things, and in some cases being made unemployed because East German companies became redundant. I think the overall picture of totalitarianism versus relative freedom, I don't believe absolute freedom exists, but certainly relative freedom is stark. And it's a bit like some Russians have nostalgia for the Stalin era. They, of course, forget the purges. They forget the massive persecution that underwent during his era. They forget all the excesses of communism. And you get it in China. Although China is a bit different because it's still ruled by the same regime. But you get it for the Mao era. I think in the case of China, it's nostalgia for the Mao era because that was kind of traditional socialism. With the Mao era, there wasn't really crony capitalism that you get today. But this nostalgia for communism, I mean, certainly communist cheek sells well. You can go into Hamburg or Berlin or Munich or any big German city, you'll find stalls selling, old USSR hats and so on, and it's bizarre, but it's kind of like communist cheek. And yet communism as an ideology caused immense human misery, suffering and persecution. East Germany, 1953, over 100 killed in the uprising against the communist system then. 1956, Poznan, Poland, about 100 killed. 1956, Hungary, over 3,000 killed. 1968, Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia as it then was, over 100 killed in Prague Spring, or the consequences, the aftermath of Prague Spring. 1970, Poland, at least 40 killed in the unrest there. This is the legacy of communism in Europe. And that's only scratching the surface. That isn't including the hundreds, probably thousands of politically motivated executions. Arrests, intimidation, kangaroo courts, secret police informants, neighbours turning on neighbours. That's the legacy of communism, and I, for one, will always consider November 1989 a good thing. No matter how imperfect the aftermath was, and still is, I look on that event as a profoundly good thing. No one can tell me those images of people celebrating, pouring champagne, shaking hands with guards that only a few years before would have shot them, was anything other than a good thing. And whilst it's not for me to tell East Germans how to feel regarding this nostalgia thing, I do think it's kind of a Stockholm syndrome. I think they remember the positive side and conveniently forget the negative side. I mean, I refuse to believe that given a choice between living in a system where you can freely express your opinion versus living in a system where you will go to jail for dissent, where you're kept behind walls with a machine gun, nothing will convince me that's a better system. If it were, then the world today would have lots of communist systems. It doesn't. There were a lot of factors as to why communism collapsed in 1989, or at least European communism did. But I I think it comes down to the fundamentals that ultimately people wanted freedom. They were tired of that system. I was watching a documentary earlier about 1983. This is only 6 years before the wall fell. One of the most dangerous years in human history. It's up there with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Very interesting BBC documentary from, I think it was BBC, it may have been another channel, but I think it was BBC, 2007. Very interesting documentary. It's not as well documented as Cuban Missile Crisis, but it was arguably just as dangerous. And there was one Russian military officer, intelligence officer, who effectively prevented World War III. He passed away, I believe it was last year or the year before, and frustratingly I forget his name off the top of my head, but that man possibly prevented all-out nuclear war, because what had actually happened was the Soviet nuclear warning system had malfunctioned. He recognised this was a mistake and there weren't incoming US missiles. He made that call, and the world should be eternally grateful to that man. And it is very irritating, I don't remember his name off the top of my head, but I'll try and put it under the link. Anyway, that's my thoughts on the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. It hasn't been perfect since. There are still serious discrepancies in Germany. The AfD is on the rise. But I do think people would do well to remember just what that wall represented, and the fact that in all those years, all those people tried to get out of the East. Very, very few people tried to get into the East from the West. A few did. A few eccentric Westerners who maybe wanted adventure. A few defectors. But overwhelmingly, it was the other way around. People trying to get into the West. So that's my thoughts. If you're German, do let me know your views. I'd particularly like to know German perspectives here, East or West. What do you think of it? How much do you think Germany has come forward since then? Let me know your thoughts. And the final few words, Brexit is actually the most turbulent political event, with the exception of the breakup of Yugoslavia, to happen since the Berlin Wall. So what if this country brings Europe in another direction? I don't know. That may prove historically to be as significant, and I don't know what to think of that. So let me know your thoughts.